Hey, everybody, it's Ed. Before we start, I've got some podcast supporters I want to thank. Scott Rutz and Steven Slingerland. Both Scott and Steven signed up to support the podcast at mountainandprairie.com/support. And if you go to that site and check it out, there are a lot of different options. There's monthly support options. There's one-time support options. I really, really appreciate anybody who does any version of that. So thank you all very much. As far as monthly support, I do that through a service called Patreon, and there's some different benefits that come with that. I send out a monthly email, kind of a behind-the-scenes type thing, towards the end of every month. And I've also started doing video updates where I mostly talk about different books I'm reading, books that I may not have recommended other places, and just give a little bit more commentary on them. And so far, people seem to be enjoying it. So if you're interested in any of that, I'd really appreciate it. No pressure at all. Podcast is free, always will be. But for those of you who do choose to support it, thank you very, very much. Hey, this is Ed Roberson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation, or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guest today is Heather Hansman. Heather is a Seattle-based writer and editor, as well as the author of the excellent new book, Powder Days, Ski Bums, Ski Towns, and the Future of Chasing Snow. Longtime listeners will remember Heather's first appearance on the podcast when we talked about her book Downriver, which is one of my favorite books about the complicated subject of water in the West. Heather has an uncanny ability to distill complex, sometimes messy topics into fun-to-read narratives that are equally educational and entertaining. And she's done it once again with Powder Days. It's a thoughtful and thorough examination of ski culture, the ski industry, and the myriad of challenges that can accompany life in ski communities. Heather was born and raised on the East Coast, but headed west immediately after college, where she spent many winters living and working in ski towns throughout the Rocky Mountains. She eventually left the ski bum lifestyle behind to pursue a career in journalism, but has remained closely connected to skiing and the ski culture for all of her adult life. Given her professional success as a journalist and her personal love of skiing, Heather is uniquely qualified to offer this nuanced, in-depth look at skiing and its impact on the culture, economy, and environment of mountain towns throughout the United States. Heather and I connected a few days before Powder Day's publication date and talked about the book and the many important topics that it addresses. We started out talking about why she chose to write a book about the ski industry and how the many issues and challenges facing Western ski communities are representative of broader issues facing the American West. We talk about the history of skiing in the United States and how the industry has grown and transformed over the past 70 years. We discuss income inequality in ski towns, as well as the prevalence of mental health and substance abuse problems that often plague these communities. We talk about the psychological profiles of sensation-seeking skiers, the big business of skiing and ski resorts, equity in outdoor recreation, climate change's effect on skiing, and much more. Whether you're a skier or not, I highly recommend that you check out Powder Days. It's a must-read for anyone interested in understanding the economic and social forces that are shaping the modern-day American West. And for more information on Heather, you can check out our first podcast episode. There's a link to that in the episode notes. Big thanks to Heather for writing yet another wonderful book, and thanks to all of you for listening. Hope you enjoy. So I was wondering if you could just kind of start out by talking about how and why you decided to focus on this particular subject that is the subject of Powder Days. Because, you know, as a journalist, you see so many interesting topics that come across your desk. And why did this particular topic catch your attention enough to be like, yeah, I want to spend 2-3 years writing a book about that?
I have a hard time giving the one-line elevator pitch about it, but basically the gist of the book is it's about the idea of like being a ski mom and being obsessed with skiing and sort of why people, myself included, get obsessed with that, and then why it's not, why like the reality is not as shiny as this kind of idea of living the dream.
Yep.
And that, I think part of it is that idea of like obsession is super interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of the other side of that is that this was my life. You know, like this is sort of, in a lot of ways, this story, like this was like a core story of me talking about myself.
Sure.
Maybe a great way to start a book. But I had been, you know, when I was just out of college, when I was 21, I moved from the East Coast. I went to college in Maine. And then I moved to Colorado kind of sight unseen because I had this like idea that I wanted to live in the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of like arbitrary decision has then shaped basically my whole life. You know, like my job, my friends, my relationships, the way I spend my time. So that is sort of this like really core story to my own life.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of washed out of this, you know, like ski bum life. I don't live in the mountains anymore. I'm not doing the kind of like seasonal, you know, service industry work I was doing for a long time. But I kind of see my friends, you know, who have been ski patrollers for the last 15 years and are trying to buy houses in mountain towns and have kids and kind of like be a person in this very specific kind of bubble.
Yep.
Struggling with it and trying to figure out how to make it work at the same time when, even especially in the last year with COVID, you know, housing inequality and all these sort of equity issues are really coming to bear in these ski towns. We know that climate change is getting worse. It sort of is this like the core question in like my life and my friend's life about this idea of like doing the thing that we love feels like it kind of it's interlaced with all these other bigger picture issues. And that to me it's sort of like, in a lot of ways, it's sort of like this question that's at the root of all these other questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess like long answer is there wasn't just like one, like, oh, that's an interesting hook. There were all these threads that felt like they were kind of interconnected that ended up shaping this book.
Yeah, it really seems like the ski town culture and the culture of the ski bum is almost like a extremely concentrated, intense version of kind of everything you see going on out here in the West, you know, with everything from climate change to the income inequality to, I don't know. It's like it's an example that can have ripple effects that go out that you can kind of apply to other parts of the region as well. And so I was never actually a ski bum, but I was kind of had one foot in that world for a while when I lived in Jackson Hole. And so I understood it. And I always had kind of the same questions about it, that the questions that you answer in this book. And so I think I wrote in my weekly email or my bi-monthly book recommendations email that I've wanted somebody to write this book for a long time. So I'm glad that you read my mind and wrote the book.
Happy to.
So maybe first thing, can you define what a ski bum is? How do you define that?
Yeah. And it's also, I don't love the term ski bum.
Yeah.
Like a little cheesy or a little like overblown. But I think that my way of framing it or thinking about it is like, you're somebody who that skiing and all the things that are like tied up in that's sort of like the central thread of what you're doing. And I think it, you know, that changes over time too. Like when I was 21 and moved to, you know, Vail to ski every day, like that, the way I felt about it then is like very different than I feel about it now, or somebody who might have then worked in that world for 20 years feels.
Yeah.
You know, but I think it's sort of like that thing that in the hierarchy of all the pieces of your life that like skiing is at the top and you will sacrifice economic stability or relationships or like all these other things to make that stay true.
Yeah. And you do such a great job in the book laying out your history doing that. I mean, so can you just give an overview of, all right, you graduate from college and then you decide you want to move to Colorado to be in a ski town. Can you just give an overview of what your life looked like for the years after college when you were kind of pursuing this seasonal employment and just living the, you know, quote, ski bum life?
Yeah. And I think part of it is that why my story kind of fit into this is I feel like I'm such a stereotype that I'm like kid from New England who moves west. Like it's I thought a lot about the kind of like frontier narrative in the US that's like so broken and problematic, but this idea of like, hey, you grow up and you go to like have an adventure and like in the 21st century, so like, okay, what adventures can we have? Like, what's the way to kind of like prove yourself? And I think that in retrospect, like that was a big part of my thought process and kind of like what felt important when I was younger. But yeah, I had been working as a raft guide summers through college. And the summer that I graduated, this guy that I didn't know very well kind of like worked for another rafting company. We were at a party and I was like, I think I want to move to the mountains. And he was like, okay, I'll get you a job. Like, no idea who I was. Like, now I understand that like they'll give anybody a job. Guy opened this door for me. So two of my best friends from college and I, packed up our little cars with our little skinny East Coast skis and drove to Colorado. And I think Katie, one of my friends, had like skied there once. I had been to Colorado in the summer. Like, I really had kind of no idea what we were getting into.
Yep.
And we got jobs scanning lift tickets at Beaver Creek, which is like the bottom of the barrel of that town job. And kind of fell into this world where it was just like skiing all the time. I started waiting tables. I would guide in the summer again. It kind of fell into this sort of like classic service job seasonal cycle that I think is fairly typical of people who make it out there and do that thing.
Yep.
And it just like pretty easily, I think a lot of people kind of wash out after a season, like you do. A lot of the people that we were kind of rookies with then went back to, Chicago or Texas or wherever. But if you kind of stick around, I think that the game kind of changes and it becomes more of a community than just like, hey, I had this adventure and now I'm gone.
I don't want to skip ahead too much, but how long were you doing that? Like, how many seasons did you do it? And then what eventually led to you deciding, all right, it's time to move on and do something else? Because, you were pretty deep in the world and you talk, I think you write very clearly about how you kind of gain respect within the community the longer you stay there. In the first year, people don't really pay much attention, but then the longer you stay there, you kind of become an insider in ways, depending on the community. So how long were you doing this before you decided, all right, I want to do something else?
Yeah. And I think that part of that is there is a lot of skepticism around. I think this is true in a lot of places, but like, why would you kind of become friends or give somebody a chance and they're maybe only going to be there for 6 months? I think there is that kind of like gatekeepery, like, okay, if you stick around for a while, we'll stop looking at you sideways. And I mean, basically why I kind of washed out of that was I got hurt. I ended up blowing out my shoulder and was like, okay, I don't know if this sort of like seasonal, rather, I'm dependent on my body thing is going to feel good in the long term. And it's been interesting, especially kind of going back and doing the research for this book and like thinking about my story. I have this kind of narrative that I tell that I'm like, oh yeah, that was the best. Like all we had to do was like ski and hang out with our friends. My life was so great. But going back and, reading my journals from those times and that kind of thing, I was pretty anxious and nervous and not sure if this was like the right thing. There's so much more. And this is one of the things that's like super interesting to me, I think, about this lifestyle or this assumption of living the dream is that there's so much more. It's not just, best day ever all the time. So I think that I had this sort of like anxiety. I wasn't sure if I fit in. I was trying to, search for the right thing. So I think long story short, I ended up getting hurt. I'd been writing a little bit. I applied to journalism school kind of that season when I was in a sling and hung up, and then kind of shifted into writing about skiing. And I was still kind of living in the mountains a little bit and volunteer ski patrolling and kind of still in that world. But that was kind of an avenue out of it for me where I could still feel sort of connected, but it wasn't like my whole sense of self-worth and community and all these things was tied up in an activity.
Yeah.
Which I think is really hard.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things I just loved about this book, we were talking about this before we started recording, is that it's similar to Downriver in that, you've got your own personal story that the book is kind of built around, but you dig so deep into all these different issues related to, in Downriver it was water, but in this it's about the ski culture. And you talk about everything from the psychology of it to the economics of it to, the environmental impacts of it. And it's all put out in this way that is super fun to read. And then when you're finished, you're like, man, I learned a lot too. It was fun and I learned a lot. And I think that's just such a great talent you have and a skill. I mean, I know you work really hard at it. Can you talk a little bit about the psychology of skiers, people that commit their life to skiers? And that was one of the things I found really interesting. early on in the book, you kind of lay out the psychological profile of your typical person who is obsessed with skiing and will put all things to the side to do that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And that was one of the most interesting things in the research. That was like one of the most interesting things I kind of dug into. And it was something I hadn't, when I was kind of sketching out the book and thinking what it was going to be about, that wasn't something that was really front of mind. And then that became such a significant thread through the book. And basically, because I think it's easy to think like, oh, whatever, you chose to, like chase this adrenaline thing. But if you go into the brain science, there's basically, I'm going to get this wrong off the top of my head, but there's basically sort of like 5 big personality factors in psychology that, like everyone has some balance of. And sensation seeking is one of the big 5.
Yep.
And so it's this idea that like everybody has a set point for like how much adrenaline, how much feeling, how much, like intensity they need. And everyone's set point is kind of like what it is. Like you see little kids on the playground, like, the ones who are like, go down the slide again, jump off the thing. And then there's kids who are like much more cautious. And if you're somebody who has that like high sensation seeking threshold, that's just like part of your makeup. It's what you need. You need that kind of stimulation to feel like yourself. It's also tied to like, like gambling and drug use and all these other sort of like not great things. Yep. But some people just need that more than others. And so there's that kind of like built in, the nature nurture factor is pretty interesting here. So there's some kind of like built in level. And then when you're like in a society where everyone's kind of like pushing and you're kind of constantly jacking up your levels, your body gets used to that.
Yes.
There's a guy, Ryan Burke, who's a psychologist in Jackson. And the way he explained it to me, he's like, dopamine isn't like a satisfaction chemical. It's not like you get a hit and you feel good. You get a hit and then you want more. It's like your body's constantly trying to chase that. And if you're in that world where that's kind of like, you're built like that, you need that, and then it's socially reinforced, like you're kind of always on this, they call it the hedonic treadmill. So like, it's like you're kind of always moving forward. In a lot of these places, you also get like positive reinforcement for that. Like if you're the one going and jumping off the biggest cliff or skiing this like crazy line, then you get recognition for it. I mean, especially now when everything's on social media. So it's sort of this really interesting, like part of it is you needing it in your body. And part of it is like, then that's how you fit into society. And, if you're on the savannah trying to like stay with your pod and you get recognition for that, like your body knows that's important. So I think it's easy to kind of write it off as like this sort of superficial thing, but there's a lot tied up in that, especially when we live in these kind of like soft times where it's hard to get those, hard to get that stimulation.
Yeah, there was a part in there that I remember I had underlined it where you talk about, I believe it was one of the psychologists was talking about this appeal or allure of going to the mountains to kind of prove yourself, and how that's just something that's kind of ingrained in a lot of us. And when things are, whether we're doing stuff at work or just the complex, somewhat annoying stuff that makes up a lot of life, if you can go into the mountains and prove yourself, it kind of taps into a part of our psyche that, first of all, it's very simple. It's like you against nature, and you go out there and there's not all this other kind of stuff that is distracting. And then it's, it's hard and you're pushing yourself. And I think it seems that certain people are just wired to want that more than others. Do you agree with that?
Totally. Yeah. And I think even for myself, it's hard I know that feeling inside of me, and it's hard to explain it.
Yes.
Like, why do I feel compulsive? Like it's Sunday when we're talking today, and it's like, I need to get outside and move my body today. Like, what is that? There's like something inside me that I know is there that's very hard to articulate and explain.
Yes. I know the feeling. It makes me crazy.
My job totally fails because I'm like, I don't have the words for that.
So to back up a little bit, I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but can you give an overview of the U.S., of the industry of skiing in the U.S.? Because I didn't know any of that, just kind of how it all sprung out of kind of post-World War II. I didn't know any of that, despite having been out here and been in businesses associated with the ski industry. And I thought you laid it out so well. Can you just give kind of a thumbnail sketch of how the ski industry came to be in the U.S.? Yeah.
And, I think sort of in the pre-World War II era, there were sort of pockets of Steamboat Springs had a really big sort of like Nordic culture. There was already some sort of like ski jumping going on there. New England had a little bit of like a ski culture. You know, people were kind of climbing up Mount Washington and starting to like get around on skis. And then I don't know if on the podcast you've ever talked about the 10th Mountain Division, but they were basically this crew. They were based in Camp Hale in Colorado, and they were this crew of soldiers who were trained to basically like, you know, do warfare in the mountains. And they were only deployed for a little while. They'd done a lot of sort of like intense training to be able to get around on skis. And they went to, I think they were mainly in the Dolomites. I'm going to get the history. Somebody's going to correct me about this. But,
well, they need to just buy the book. They can buy the book and get it.
Yeah. There's a really good book that has all this. And then a lot of these guys came back, and they had been, you know, they were like in their kind of like early mid-20s, and they had seen the European ski world and seen all these kind of little towns that had skiing as, you know, the thread of culture and the way that people got around. And so a lot of these guys came back and became the people who started Vail and Aspen and, you know, all these different sort of what's now a lot of our major ski areas kind of had seen this thing in Europe and also had come back from war and kind of rejected this like sort of straight-laced, you get a job, you worked in this line. So I think there was this sense of adventure that we've talked about, and this sort of like, okay, I've seen this thing and I can turn it into an industry. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of it was really built out from those, you know, like that group of people. And then after World War II, you know, like there was also a lot of people coming back, economically things changed. People had a lot more disposable income. Cars were better, recreation was better, you know, like people could get around more. So it really kind of sprung out from that. And, you know, the economic arc, I think, is pretty interesting, that especially right now, skiing is such a stratified, expensive, elite thing. And it has been for a long time. But I think there was a period where, you know, every little town in New Hampshire had a rope tow, you know, like that was in some ways, I think, even though like the 60s and 50s and 60s and 70s, skiing was much harder. I think that's sort of like the glory days of when it was accessible and exciting and really growing.
And to continue just jumping all over the place, can you talk about how the economics have changed? Because I feel like even just since I moved out west, you know, I moved to Jackson Hole in 2005, and I feel like just in that 16-year period, the whole industry has changed completely, as far as the way it's structured, the number of companies, who owns what. And so I don't know, from say the 90s until now, how has the business changed from whether it's an ownership or a price, just in general? How would you describe the changes that have taken place in the ski industry?
Yeah. And I think you're totally right that and it's funny, pretty much everyone I talked to for the book who, you know, like was a ski bum was kind of like, I was the last generation. Yeah. And, you know, like people from the 70s said that, people from the 90s. And I moved to Vail, same in 2005. And I'm kind of like, we were the last stand. Yeah. Because, I mean, the internet has really changed things in terms of how people communicate and like share their experience. But I think the economic side is a really big part of it. In part because resort ownership has consolidated so much. And there's been, in the 90s, there was American Ski Company, that was on the East Coast. And there have been some sort of like collective ownership groups for a long time. But right now, there's kind of two major, Alterra and Vail are kind of like the two major resort groups. And they bought up a bunch of ski areas. And then they have this sort of like collective economic power where they can set the price for lift tickets and for season passes, and smaller ski areas kind of can't compete, which really changes the game and changes what it's like for people getting into skiing. It changes, you know, they're also, Vail especially is like a big real estate owner in a lot of these towns. So that changes kind of like what's getting built and where. And then at the same time as that sort of like top down ownership was changing, the kind of like bottom up property management and ownership has changed a lot. Sorry, I just whacked my microphone. And Airbnb has really changed the game for who can live in ski towns. This sort of, a lot of these places, you know, especially since COVID, I mean, things have really changed in the last 2 years too. That in a lot of these places, there might be jobs for people, but there's no housing because, you know, like easy. And this is sort of like you were saying earlier, I think this is sort of like an economic story that's about way more than just recreation towns, but
yes.
sort of economic disparity where like the very, very high level have so much power. You know, I spent a chunk of time in Aspen this summer, and there's not a house for sale in Aspen for under like $10 million.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so that sort of, and a lot of these ski towns are sort of like small, isolated. The footprint of the valley is pretty condensed and specific. So there's a point where like you can't really build out, but then you're pricing out the people who are actually living in those towns. So yeah, I think that kind of economic story of like leveling is such a big part of what's happening there. And it's a big part of what's happening in a lot of places.
Yeah. I remember when I lived in Jackson. So it was 2005 when I moved there, and I had a, quote, real job. And so I had a place in town with a roommate or two. And, it was still it wasn't like straight up ski bum lifestyle, but it wasn't at all like a stable life. I mean, it was me and my dog and then with some guys, and everybody's kind of crazy acting, even though we had normal jobs. But I remember that a lot of the workers, who kept the town running and kept the resort running, and a lot of them were workers of Hispanic descent and they all lived over on the other side of the Teton Pass in Idaho because there was no affordable housing for anybody who, didn't make a decent amount of money, in town. And I remember in the winter, it was treacherous because a lot of these folks were driving over the pass in, two-wheel drive vehicles. And I couldn't believe the inequality at that point. And I was just wondering kind of where it would go. And it's only gotten worse. It probably exponentially worse since then. So, I mean, how does that work? How does that work in ski towns in 2020 or 2021 when the people who actually do the work to keep these places going can't live there? Well, I mean, how does that work from just a straight up, I don't know. I mean, just how does it work?
It doesn't work. I think that's the thing. And I think I think it's really coming to a head. I think the next couple of years are going to be really interesting in terms of this, because I think it's really coming to a head in terms of resorts not being able to find workers. I think a lot of, Vail Resorts just announced a $15 minimum wage. Like they're trying to bring the bottom up, and they're trying to build affordable. A lot of places are working on affordable housing, but I think that it's so skewed already. And I think you're seeing this, I was in Moab recently, and in Moab, the McDonald's had a sign up for $20 an hour.
Wow.
Trying to find workers. Yeah. Cause I think that, so many people, these places have become so unlivable, and especially in service jobs, I think COVID has kind of pushed people to the point where they're like, I'm not going to potentially put myself, in the line of fire. We're thinking a lot about what essential workers are. But I think, I think I was talking to the guy who runs Arapahoe Basin. I think this was sometime in the last year, so it wasn't super recently, but he was saying that they're already having a hard time finding lifties, finding people to work these kind of like base level jobs. And I think part of the thing about being a ski bum or working these kind of like seasonal jobs is the appeal. Mm-hmm. And if you're like, okay, like, yeah, maybe you're going to like live in a shack with 15 other people, but you get to ski every day and it's going to be awesome. And I think there is a tipping point where like, it's maybe not worth it for people when the suffering gets that bad or it just becomes so unlivable. Then I think this is sort of like this societal question about like, how do we value workers? How do we make sure people are, like safe and taken care of? What's our social safety net? That's really crucial. And I think this is part of why obviously this is such a part of my story, but like the more I dug in, the more that kind of like, how are these towns a metaphor for all these other things felt really front of mind. And I think it is like, I think I kind of came away from this book with more questions than answers.
Yeah. Well, if you had to guess, obviously you're not a fortune teller here, but when like you give a great example, I think towards the end of the book about Telluride and how they tried to put in a lot of open space, and it was with the best of intent, but when they did that, all of a sudden it cut down on the amount of buildable land. And so it just skyrocketed, basically supply and demand, and the prices continue to go up. So it seems like we're dealing with two things here. One, like in the case of Vail Resorts, we're dealing with a publicly traded company who all they want to do is make money. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. That's very clear. They need to return money to the shareholders. That's fine. And so by doing that, they try to keep people's wages as low as possible. And they would say that. That's not a secret. And then the other thing is there's just a physical lack of places for people to live. And so it seems like that's getting into a place where there aren't many solutions. So, I mean, where do you see things going in 5, 6, 10 years from now? It's say somewhere like, not even ridiculous, but say somewhere like Vail, not Aspen or somewhere, but Vail. Like what's going to happen? Yeah, it's crazy. That's not ridiculous.
Because it's all ridiculous. And I think those two things that you kind of nailed down, I think that kind of like, how are these publicly traded companies going to think about their long-term viability is a big part of it. And I think it is, like I said, like Vail Resorts just committed to, rising wages. I think they're going to have to do a lot of kind of financial to make it work. And this is me being probably a little too, idealistic and rose-colored glasses because I'm not a business person. But I think to make it viable in the long term, they're going to have to work a lot on retention and livability and, whether that's employee housing or, there's benefits for workers. So it makes sense for them to come back. I think there's going to have to be a big move there. And then I think in terms of the kind of mountain town, I think there's sort of the company side of things. And I think there's also sort of a local government side of things. And how do we kind of try and make these places livable? And I think a lot of it, I talked to some folks in Aspen, the kind of housing inequality chapter is based in Aspen because Aspen is a totally fascinating case study on this because Aspen kind of had one of the first affordable housing programs in a mountain town. And this was back in, I think the 70s or 80s when affordable housing was this kind of bad word, this thing that people did in the cities.
Yeah.
So we don't do here. But they were really ahead of the game. But even now, people moved into those affordable housing units in the 80s and they're still there. And they've grown up. I have a friend who's parents, his dad was a mountain manager at Snowmass and he grew up in the affordable housing and his parents are still there. And he's kind of okay, what do I do now? Mm-hmm. There's not stock. And so I think a lot of that is going to be changing. I think maybe Aspen's a better example than Vail, maybe, because I think Vail's not as cute as Aspen.
Yeah.
But Aspen has this, the downtown has all these little, gingerbread cottages, and then you have these huge mansions on the hills. But I think part of it is going to have to be changing the footprint of those towns and building denser and building higher and changing the look of those places just to cram more people into the valley. And I think, part of the appeal of these places is that you do have mountain access and you have views and you do feel like you're in nature. And I think some of that stuff is going to have to be compromised to make them livable. And it's a really tricky balance of okay, how do we preserve Telluride? How do we preserve the open space and still make town dense enough that it's livable? Yeah, like I said, I've got more questions than I do answers here, but I think it's really tricky.
It definitely is. Can you describe there's a term you use in there, and I supposedly I have a degree in economics, but a lot of this stuff was new to me. Talk about the Gini coefficient. I thought that was very interesting. And I promise people, this isn't an econ class. This is very useful stuff, but talk about the Gini coefficient and what that measures and how it can predict kind of how a society operates.
Yeah. It's basically a measure of, inequality and how far the top of the pile is from the bottom of the pile. Mm-hmm. And so in terms of in somewhere like Aspen, where you have, and Aspen's easy to pick on, but it's a very clear thing where you have these bajillionaires, some of the richest people in the world have houses in Aspen. And then the base level kind of minimum wage for, somebody who's working housekeeping, somebody who's working, 4 or 5 jobs in the valley just so they can rent a place, an hour out of town is so different. So it's basically the spread of from the top and the bottom.
Yeah. And I feel like my wife went to grad school for international development, and she was telling me about the Gini coefficient. I remember during grad school and how it's a predictor of how well a society is going to function. And the more that there is that gap, the crazier things get you look at some of these almost like failed states, and they've got a huge Gini coefficient. And so you look at a lot of these, it seems like on a very microscopic scale, a lot of these ski towns are turning into just the case study for a gap, like the biggest gaps in the United States, I would guess.
Yeah. And I think, Jackson Hole, Teton County, I think is the most unequal county in the country.
That is so crazy.
The spread is but it makes, my brother's an economist, and we've talked about this a bunch over the, course of me working on this book. And he was like, ski towns are interesting because there's no, like, if you look at like a New York or San Francisco, the reason people move there is because the wages are high there. Mm-hmm. And so like, you're going to move to New York and you're going to make a New York salary working on Wall Street or whatever. And like, then you can pay for all the things. And that's not true across the board, obviously, but there is like a point there. And if you move to a Jackson, there's not that, the economy there isn't at the level of the people who are coming in.
Yes.
Like, you're only moving there for the desirability. You're not moving there for like the wage bump or something like that.
And the tax benefits.
Like, exactly. Yeah, that was a whole other question. But like, so there's like the level, there's basically no bottom line. So like, it gets so skewed and so spread out because the only reason you're there is because you want to be. Not only, like, obviously there's a necessary workforce, but at the top of the pile, it's just desirability.
It really has changed so much since I lived there. I mean, there was a lot of your book is based in Jackson, and it was so interesting for me to read it and think about it. Cause when I was in Jackson, I was in the luxury real estate business. I was selling these big ranches, these rich people. And so it was weird because like on the weekends or whatever, I'd be hanging around with the quote ski bum types, 20 dudes piled into some little apartment and everybody's just cracking crazy. But then during the week, I'm picking up some guy at his private jet. And so it was kind of like seeing both sides, but it seems like that was like innocent, kind of silly stuff compared to what's going on in these towns now. It just seems like it's all on steroids. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it is like now these people who are, like, especially in the last couple of years, like you can work that New York job from Jackson now. And you can have, if you are able to do that, you have the benefits of like, okay, I can still ski from, 9 to 3 and then go to my New York job or something like that. And I think I was talking to somebody who had moved to Jackson in the 80s, I think. And he was like, yeah, it used to be that like, okay, you moved here and you sacrificed everything else to like make this happen. And he's like, now people don't have to make those sacrifices. So like, they're not as, it's like going back to this idea of like, what is a ski bum? Like that, if you're trying to put bounds around that, it's really different now. Mm-hmm. Do you not, like I was saying, like I worked like 4 different crappy jobs to kind of like make it work. And I think some people are still doing that, but some people don't necessarily have to do that. And if you're 22 and just graduated from college, is that appealing still?
And so talking about Aspen reminded me of Alden Schindler, who I've had on this podcast. And then that reminds me of, obviously, of climate change. And so how does climate change fit into all this? I mean, obviously, there's just billions and billions and billions of dollars at work with these publicly traded companies. And there's just a lot of money here. But there's this looming threat in the future that maybe there won't be any snow. So how does climate change fit into this whole story?
Yeah, I mean, like that's none of it works if we don't have snow, right?
Yep.
Like that's the thing. And Alden's a really interesting one because it's his job at Aspen to kind of be thinking about sustainability and thinking about how to make the company, I skied with him a bit when I was there and he was like, yeah, this, like my job is basically to like make this thing work forever. And he's very aware of like, okay, like if we don't have snow, if there's no winter, the whole thing falls apart. And so I think that it's been maybe up until the last couple of years, it's been really scary for resort managers or like people in power to talk about that because it kind of like opens the door to the threat. So I think in a lot of ways, like the ski industry has not been ahead of the curve on that, which is, and I mean, like, this is also true of everywhere, like we haven't been ahead of it. But I think that's another one of those kind of like remains to be seen. How much can we change policy? How much can these companies change how they operate to make sure we kind of, work on carbon reduction so we have winter in the future? And, I mean, one of the kind of, to go back to this like inequality thing, which is such a thread through this, like I was talking to a meteorologist, and he was like, like some places are going to lose out, and they're already losing out, and some places are going to probably do better. Like you have the like low, like in coastal Oregon or in even Tahoe, it's pretty low elevation, or New England where I grew up. Some of those places, especially the smaller hills that don't have the kind of like Vail level funding to invest in snowmaking or things like that, are going to suffer. But some of the places that are at higher elevation that have, like deeper pockets, like he was like, Mammoth Mountain, which is like high up and part of like one of these conglomerates, or Breckenridge or something like that. Like those places, as other places fall away and those places still have snow, like maybe they're going to do better. So I think like there are winners and losers, which is this really kind of like grim, fatalistic, dystopian way of looking at it. But like,
no, I've thought that before as well with climate change, because a lot of my day-to-day work is in agriculture, conservation agriculture. And as unfortunately, there are going to be a lot of places that dry up, or climate change creates situations where there's not enough water, particularly in the West, to grow crops.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
I would guess, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, but places that have been too cold historically, all of a sudden will be able to grow crops. And I'm not saying that that's a good thing or anything, but it's just, there's going to be these massive changes. It's just hard to know. It's really hard to know. And then, not to be a downer about it, but you just see the confusion and chaos that's come from an acute crisis like COVID and our inability to fix that. And so then you wonder, like, we still got a pretty good runway on this climate change thing, but I don't know. I'm not feeling great about our ability to fix it.
It's so similar to the water stuff too, because it's so hard to like be decisive and make a call before you're in. I mean, you're saying this in the Colorado River Basin now. Like, it's how do you try and predict the future? How do you kind of plan for the worst case scenario when you don't even know what that's going to be? How do you get people to act? It's hard because all of this is like huge framework economic. Like the changes are huge, and I think it's so human nature and easy to just kind of like dink around and be like, okay, let's see what happens, until it's too late. Yeah. Like, really? I swear this book is fun.
No, it's definitely fun. But I think it's fun, but you clearly identify all these different issues that even somebody like me, and I would imagine this book, writing this book was a learning process for you as well. And, we've lived in these places, but I'd never thought about some of these issues, and they need to be thought about. They need to be discussed. I think it's definitely a fun book. I mean, I loved reading it, but it's one of those books that's fun, but it makes you think, which I think is the sweet spot for me. Kind of a random question for you, but what was it like going back and going back into these ski towns, seeing some people that maybe you knew when you were in your early 20s working and living there? What was it? Was it weird, or was it cool, or was it fun to kind of jump back into that world? What was it like after being an official grown up for quite a while?
I mean, I feel like one of the big questions in this book for me is like, am I a grown up? Like, how do you be a grown up?
I don't think I am. And we had to cancel this thing because I had a sick kid. I don't think I'm a grown up.
Yeah. But that's like one of the that's a question that I sit with a lot in my own life, is like the sliding doors of my life. Like, what if instead of taking this path that I'm on now, I had stayed in ski patrol and was like still living, like, I think one of the things I thought about a lot, and, I was telling you the story of like the guy who got me the job initially, like, what if when I was 21, I had like gone to be an English teacher in Boston instead of jumping on this idea that this guy threw out and headed west. Like, it's like that kind of like, what are those decisive things that flip your life one way or another, is so interesting to me. And it was really, in a lot of ways, it like felt funny and weird to kind of like I showed up at Beaver Creek where I worked right at, like when I was 21 and 22, and like stuck my head into the ski patrol hut. And I was like, oh, I know half the people here still. Like, and someone's like, oh, Heather, you're here. It's funny that it's so easy to slip right back into it. And like, I spent a lot of this, I was on the road for basically the whole winter doing the reporting for this. And a lot of it was that like, okay, I'm like rolling into Alta. I have like a friend of a friend's phone number, and I'm going to ask this random if I can sleep on their couch. And like, it was like a little bit embarrassing how easy it was to slip back into that. And like, I was like, okay, I'm like 35. I'm not 25 anymore. But I mean, part of I think part of one of the like really wonderful things about it is that there is this sort of like openness, casualness, like, yeah, sure, come stay, what do you need? That's really great. But it's also, it is like, for me, I was like, okay, what's the, people talk about ski bums as being Peter Pan. And a lot of this for me was like, am I Peter Pan? Like, how am I doing this thing? And I think you mentioned Auden, and one of the kind of most interesting things that Auden said to me that has really stuck with me in all this is this idea of like, he was like, ski bums are kind of anti-citizenship. And he was like,
yes,
a lot of this kind of culture is like, I'm not going to play by the rules, and I'm just going to like slide under the surface and dirtbag and like, trade beer for my ski tunes or my lift tickets or whatever it is. And he's like, but that's not sustainable. He's like, if you want the culture to be the town, whatever it is, to like be what you want it to be, you have to be engaged, and like you have to make the future that you want to exist. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot in this book and in my own life. Like, okay, yeah, if we're the grownups now, like, what do I want things to look like? How do I make it better?
Yeah, there is that ownership. I was talking to some friends of mine last weekend who have lived in Breckenridge for 20 years. You may actually know the guy. It was kind of off the record, but I'll tell you later. But he's a writer and does some stuff for Outside. But he has seen a lot of these. He moved out, to ski, and I think he was hoping to go somewhere, and maybe Jackson Hole, and he stopped in Breckenridge. And typical story, he hadn't left for 20 years, but he's built this great life and a great career there, as has his wife. He's got 2 kids, but he's bumping up against this deal where it's becoming an unsustainable place to live. And luckily they were able to buy a place years ago before it got too out of control, but they've got a lot of friends there that just nobody can afford to live there if you've got a normal job. And so he has taken charge and has built up this coalition, and they're talking to the town council and really trying to advocate for this, for affordable housing. And so it's inspiring to see somebody like that who has really bought in. He's a part of the community, and he's kind of fighting for it. And I think it's necessary because the forces on the other side that are fighting to make it more of a resort, just a straight up resort where people come in and pay a lot of money, like, they're organized, and they're working hard. And so there has to be that response, it seems to me. And
like, money is power in a lot of ways. Like, if you're somebody local, you don't necessarily have a chunk of money to throw it. Yeah. But I think it has definitely lit a fire for me in terms of like, okay, like, we can't just like assume things are going to turn out good or get better. Like, you have to, if you want things to happen, you have to be engaged.
Alden is an interesting dude. Like, he's way ahead of all. I mean, he's been so focused on this climate change thing before a lot of people even knew what it was. And he's intense too. Like, I feel like if you follow what he's doing, like, if people follow him and follow his lead, I think everything will work out just fine because he is intense.
Yeah. And he's a funny sort of like ski bum archetype.
Yeah.
He moved, he was doing seasonal work. He moved. He was like, okay, I want to figure out how to make my life sustainable in the mountains. Okay, how do I get a real job? What do I do?
Sure. Yeah, he's funny. Kind of going back to your re-injecting into the ski world or finding, going back and visiting. And you addressed this towards the end of the book. I thought it was interesting because I was wondering about it. How did your body, your 35-year-old body, do with all the booze compared to when you were 22?
Not great things. But I think it's funny. I had a friend who's another writer read the draft pretty early, and she was like, you talk about drinking so much. And I read back through and was like, oh my God, yeah, there's like, I have a beer in my hand in like every scene. And that's such an interesting, it kind of goes back to that personality archetype thing there, that sort of being at a high level of sensation in every capacity from, like from skiing to partying is such a part of the culture there. And it can become so problematic for so many people. And a lot of these towns have super high rates of, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, like that, self-medication. So that was another one of the things that is this kind of like, where's the line on like, we're having a couple beers at Opry, we're having fun, to like super, super unhealthy. And one of the chapters in that, one of the big chunks in the back of the book is sort of this like mental health, stress. How do we deal with all these factors? And I have a friend he's a he's the same kind. He moved out from Massachusetts and he's lived at Alta for a long time. And he's a little bit younger. And for probably like the first 5 years I knew him, he was like the guy at the party and was just like always the last one up, always the person like naked rollerblading through the party or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he has since stopped drinking, and it's like, and his story of like kind of deciding to do that and then trying to figure out how to fit in the ski world when the party side of things is out of the equation has been super, super interesting to try and follow. And I think a lot of people are kind of like thinking about that in their own lives now, or like, I feel like I am at least, like how much does the partying, how much is it a part of it? How much does it have to be part of it? How much when you're in these kind of like mountain towns where the bar might be like your third place and the place where you go, you know, like you're at home, you're at work, this is your social circle. How do you kind of navigate that level of intensity and potentially abuse?
I thought that was a really interesting part because you put stats to something that I have seen and noticed. And these ski towns, you know, a lot of them, everybody's just partying and going, you know, acting wild all the time. I mean, you know, no matter what, that's the constant. And I never really thought it through in detail, but I wondered, you know, what are the long-term effects of that? And how does that play out from just either a physical health or a mental health standpoint? I thought that was a really, really interesting part. And so one more question. Obviously this book is, you know, you're kind of scratching your own itch, I imagine, by writing it, because you lived in this world and it's of great interest and you dig into it, so many different facets of this world. But I mean, you may not even do this, but like, what do you hope happens from this book? Like when you write a book, do you have an idea like, oh, I hope it'll make this change, or I hope people will be entertained? Like, what is if you even have it? And if you don't, you can be like, no, that's a weird question. But like, what is the goal for this book?
Yeah, I don't know if I think about it, come in with a goal, but I think for me, it's always like, okay, this feels like something, it's less of like, I have a place that I want to get to, but I think it's more of like, I have a question, or like, here's something that I feel, or I think I'm seeing, like, is it true? You know, like this idea of like, is being a ski bum, is living in a ski town sustainable? Like that felt like one of these, or like, did I miss out in bailing out of it? Like, what is like the good thing there? Kind of felt like the core question. Mm-hmm. And I think the same thing happened in Downriver. Like people got to the end of the book and they're like, wait, you didn't solve, you know, like drought. I was like, no. There's like way smarter people. I don't think I think part of why these things are interesting is because they are so like thorny and complicated. And I don't think I'm smart enough. I don't think, you know, like there's all these people who've been thinking about these inequality questions and climate change questions. Like I'm not vain enough to think that I can come in and be like, I figured it out, guys. Like, here's the deal. But I think it's just like, yeah, how do we think about this? How do we talk about this? And we were talking, I think, before we started about like why people like books, or like why certain books resonate. And I think part of it for me is like the books that I like to read sort of like take you on this, like kind of like dig into questions. And I feel like that was what I was trying to do here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, I don't have I feel like if I had come away from the end of it being like, here's the way to do it, like that would have been not true. And it would have been like a self-help book instead of
yes. No, that's the thing. And you know, the real world is messy and there are no right answers. And I think about this podcast, like it took me till I was 27 to move to Jackson Hole. And I always think like, man, if I had been able to listen to conversations with like people like you and people that I've had on this podcast, that would have helped me to maybe speed up the process, or it would have given me more information about how things really are and how people really are outside of my little bubble there in North Carolina. And I feel like this book is the same thing. Like if I were 21 and getting ready to graduate from college, I would really appreciate having this book to really understand what does it mean to move, you know, quote, out west and work work in the ski world? Like, cause nothing is as great as it is advertised, nothing. And so, yeah. And so this book is, I mean, I think it's interesting for somebody like me who has no interest in it, no interest in being a ski bum at this point. But I feel like it gives a clear picture, as messy as it is, of everything that's involved in this part of the West that is, such a core part of the economy and the culture and everything. So I think it's awesome.
Yeah. And I know for me, like one of the core questions is like, yeah, like I know how messy and problematic and shitty it is in a lot of ways. And like, I'm still obsessed with it.
Yeah.
Like that sort of like sitting with all that is like, I think the thing that feels interesting to me, or the thing that felt worth digging into is like, even when you see all the broken parts, there's still something there that's like, yeah, like it's November right now. And I'm like, okay, I'm ready. Like skiing. Let's go.
So what else are you working on these days? I don't want you to tell about any secret projects, but I know you're writing with Outside on a regular basis. Like what other projects do you have going on?
Yeah, I've got the Outside column, which is always sort of like a fun way to look at what's going on in the outdoor world. And then I'm going to say it because I want it to be true. I'm working on a new book proposal.
Yes.
Which would be like more of like an essay collection about sort of like it's like that same question of like, okay, if we're the grownups now, how do we live with climate change? What are the kind of like problematic stories that we got told, and what's it going to look like in the future?
I'll look forward to that.
It's pretty loose right now, but I feel like if I talk about it, I have to make it real.
Yeah, that's like signing up for a race, and tell people you're doing it. Like, I have to do it now. I can't help it. Have you read any good books? What any good books? Doesn't have to be related to climate change or skiing or anything, but I'm always looking for recommendations.
Yeah, what have I read? I was just looking at I read a really good YA book recently called it's either called The Fire Watcher's Daughter or The Fire Keeper's Daughter. One of them is a Brandy Carlisle album. One of them is the book.
I'll put links to both.
Yeah, they're both really good. And it's about this girl who grows up on a reservation in Minnesota and sort of gets looped into this sort of like FBI crime bust about meth. So it's this really interesting. Fire Keeper's Daughter is the book.
Okay.
And yeah, it's just this like really cool story I hadn't heard told before that I really loved. What else have I read recently that I really liked? Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead is this. No, I think it was just nominated for the Booker, one of those big awards. And it's about this woman who's like an aviator in kind of the like 30s, 40s, 50s, and she goes on this. She tries to fly around the world. Mm-hmm. I really loved that. What else have I? I can't hold anything in my brain anymore. I need to start making a book list like you.
No, don't waste your time with that. Keep writing this stuff. Like the last thing you need to be doing is being distracted. Like you keep doing exactly what you're doing. Cause I mean, I love Downriver. I love Powder Days. It's been awesome getting to know you over the years. And I just appreciate everything you do. I mean, I think it really, all your work really speaks to me, and a lot of people who listen to this podcast love it as well. So thanks for coming on during what's getting ready to be a super busy time for you, and keep up the great work.
Yeah, no, it's really fun. I'm excited for when are we going to see your book, Ed?
I might need some help with that. I need a ghostwriter. You in the ghostwriting business? No, I'm just joking. Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way, so head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.